The searchlight from that Japanese destroyer sliced across the dark water like a cold, white blade. It missed our bow by only a few feet. Nobody dared breathe. We'd cut our engines to a low idle, drifting silently in the black waters off Vella Lavella. 23 of us, American sailors packed tight on the deck of PT-164, were trying our damnedest to disappear into the night. Just beyond that destroyer, 3 Japanese transports carried nearly 8,000 soldiers, men who had no idea their voyage to reinforce Kolombangara was about to end beneath the surface of the Solomon Sea. The date was July 19, 1943, and in exactly 4 minutes, we were going to unleash hell from the shadows. My hands clenched the twin .50 caliber mount so hard my knuckles burned. Beside me, Ensign Robert Dutch Vanderberg leaned close, whispering coordinates to our skipper, Lieutenant Commander Arthur M. McPhersonson. The soft green glow of the compass was the only light we dared to show. Behind us, tucked into the dark silhouette cast by Vella Lavella's volcanic peaks, PT-168 and PT-171 waited for our signal. We were America's secret weapons, and the Japanese Navy was about to learn the hard way that the night didn't belong to them anymore. My name's Chief Petty Officer Tom Harrigan, United States Navy Reserve. I was one of the first men to prove that small wooden boats could take down steel warships. Folks sometimes ask me what it felt like to be part of the most closely guarded naval secret of 1943. The truth. We were too busy trying not to die to think about making history. All we knew was that if we failed that night, 8,000 Japanese troops would make it to Kolombangara, and our boys fighting for that airfield wouldn't stand a chance. Every torpedo on board meant hundreds of American lives that might be saved. Every Japanese transport we sent to the bottom meant one less family back home getting that awful telegram from the War Department. To understand how 3 little boats, smaller than most private yachts, could take on the Imperial Japanese Navy at the height of its power, you've got to know what we were up against in the summer of '43. The Japanese were masters of the night. Ever since their victory off Savo Island the previous August, when they sank 4 Allied cruisers without losing a ship, they ruled the darkness over the Solomons. Their sailors trained for years in night combat, learning to fight without radar, guided only by sharp eyes and perfect coordination. They called their nighttime supply runs the Tokyo Express. We called it the Rat Run. Whatever the name, they moved men and supplies almost untouched once the sun went down. Sure, the U.S. Navy had the bigger ships, better radar, and heavier guns. But we were losing the night war. Our admirals, still thinking in the old terms of Jutland and Manila Bay, couldn't keep up with this new kind of fighting. Our cruisers and destroyers, built for open ocean fleet battles, were sitting ducks in the narrow island channels of the Solomons. We needed something new, something fast, unexpected, something the enemy wouldn't see coming. That answer was being built in secret boatyards from New Orleans to New York, an invention born of desperation and American ingenuity. The patrol torpedo boat, or PT boat, was unlike anything that came before it. Just 80 feet long and 20 feet across, made not of steel but of layered mahogany plywood, these boats would change naval warfare forever. 3 Packard V-12s, modified Liberty aircraft engines, gave those boats the shove to hit better than 45 knots, quicker than any torpedo or conventional warship could manage. We carried 4 21-inch torpedo tubes loaded with Mark 13s, an Oerlikon 20mm cannon, 50 caliber machine guns, and enough ammo to make a real racket for maybe 15 minutes of steady fighting. After that quarter hour, you either pointed for home or you were headed for the bottom. I first laid eyes on a PT boat in February 1943 at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron Training Center in Melville, Rhode Island. I came off destroyer duty in the North Atlantic and was still a green hand when the Navy began asking for volunteers for hazardous duty on experimental craft. The recruiter wouldn't tell us what the boats were, only that the casualty rate was expected to top 50%. Out of 200 volunteers, 40 were picked. I made the cut because I could navigate by the stars, and I'd learned small boat handling growing up on Chesapeake Bay. The first time I stepped aboard PT-164, I figured the Navy had lost its mind. This wasn't a warship so much as a souped-up speedboat with big ambitions. The hull was wood, layered mahogany, laughable in a war of steel and armor. Living space was so tight, hot bunking wasn't just common. It was the rule. There was no real armor apart from a little sheet metal around the bridge. One decent hit from anything bigger than a rifle, and we'd be floating kindling. Then I met McPhersonson, and everything changed. Mac was 28, ancient by PT standards, but his eyes had that haunted look of a man who'd already seen too much. He'd been at Pearl Harbor on the destroyer USS Shore when the Japanese struck, fought at Midway, and volunteered for PTs because, as he put it, "I'm tired of being a target. Time to be the hunter." Mac got something the rest of us had to learn the hard way. PT boats don't fight like regular warships. We were maritime guerrillas, seagoing assassins who hit from ambush and disappeared before the enemy could get his bearings. Our crew was a ragtag bunch, misfits and specialists who'd never have been put together on a regular Navy ship. Dutch Vanderberg, our XO, was a Yale math professor who could work torpedo firing solutions in his head faster than most men could turn a slide rule. Chief Motor Machinist's mate Carlos Charlie Mendoza used to build racing engines in Los Angeles and could make our temperamental Packards purr or roar, depending on what we needed. Radio man second class William Sparks Patterson came from the submarine service, where he'd learned to operate radios with absolute silence. Our torpedo man, gunner's mate first class Patrick Paddy O'Brien, was an artist with those mechanical fish. Each Mark 13 weighed about 2,200 pounds and cost as much as a house back home. And Paddy treated them better than most men treated their wives, always adjusting, cleaning, and sweet-talking them. "These beauties," he'd say while polishing the bronze props, "are the only reason the Japs will take us seriously. One shot, one kill, or we were just very expensive target practice." The rest of our 12-man crew rounded out with 2 more gunners, an engineer, a cook who pulled double duty as medic, and 3 seamen who did whatever needed doing. We were black and white, city boys and farm kids, dropouts and college grads, bound together by one plain fact. We'd volunteered knowing full well we might not come out of the war alive. Training at Melville was brutal and unforgiving. The Navy had learned from early PT boat losses that enthusiasm alone wouldn't cut it. We had to be faster, smarter, and meaner than anything the Japanese could throw at us. We practiced high-speed attacks until we could launch torpedoes accurately, while the boat was bouncing across waves at 40 knots. We learned to steer by sound and instinct when tropical squalls turned the world pitch black and you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. But the most valuable thing we learned was to start thinking like pirates instead of sailors. Commander James Wild Jim Patterson ran our training program. He'd survived the nightmare in the Philippines and escaped Corregidor on one of the last PT boats out. Wild Jim's training philosophy was about as straightforward as a punch in the jaw. The Japanese expect you to fight fair? Don't. They expect you to follow tradition? Don't. They expect you to fear the dark. Make them fear it instead. He drilled it into us that our deadliest weapons weren't our torpedoes or guns, but surprise, speed, and sheer nerve. We hit our forward base at Rendova on June 30th, 1943, right as the invasion of New Georgia was kicking off. The place wasn't much to look at. A fuel dump, a few camouflaged Quonset huts, and a rough wooden dock tucked under palm fronds. The first thing that hit you was the smell, a mix of diesel, salt, rotting plants, and that sweet, sick stench of tropical decay. The second thing was the sound. Distant artillery from New Georgia, where Marines were bleeding for the Munda airfield. We were part of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9, a dozen PT boats assigned to stop Japanese reinforcements moving through the Central Solomons. On paper, the mission was simple: patrol the waters between their main bases and sink anything flying the rising sun. Reality had other ideas. The islands were a maze of reefs, volcanoes, and hidden enemy positions. The Japanese had seaplanes for spotting, coast watchers on every major island, and destroyers trained specifically to hunt down PT boats. Our first patrol, July 5th, was a complete mess. 3 of our boats, including ours, tried to intercept a Japanese convoy near Vella Lavella. Before we could get into attack range, a float plane spotted us. Within minutes, 4 destroyers came charging in with searchlights blazing and guns thundering. We scattered like rabbits, weaving through columns of water thrown up by shell fire. PT-158 took a direct hit from a 5-inch shell, gone in a heartbeat. 12 men, wiped out so completely there wasn't even wreckage to recover. We spent 4 miserable hours dodging through reefs and narrow channels before we finally shook them off. No torpedoes fired, no damage to the enemy. 1 boat and 12 good men lost. That night, back at Rendova, Mac called us together. He didn't raise his voice. He just said quietly, "We learned something important tonight. We can't fight them like destroyers fight each other. We're not built for gun duels. We strike from ambush, or we don't strike at all." It was a bitter lesson, paid for in blood, but it changed how we fought from then on. Over the next 2 weeks, we built new tactics from scratch, mostly trial and error. We learned to use island radar shadows to hide our approach. We found that if we cut 2 engines and ran on 1, the boat's noise dropped so much the enemy could barely hear us. Most importantly, we worked out how to coordinate between boats using coded flashes of light, signals simple enough to be quick but invisible to the Japanese. Our intelligence network was incredible. Australian coast watchers hidden in the jungles of occupied islands sent radio messages about Japanese ship movements. Native Solomon Islanders, risking their necks if caught, paddled out in canoes to warn us of enemy patrols. Sometimes, decrypts from Pearl Harbor gave us precise convoy schedules, but most nights we hunted by instinct and gut feeling. By July of '43, PT boats were still considered top secret. Official Navy messages never mentioned us by name. They just called us small craft, or mosquito boats. The Japanese knew something was tearing into their convoys, but early reports claimed we were submarines or drifting mines. They just couldn't believe the Americans were mad enough to send wooden speedboats against steel warships. That ignorance was our greatest advantage. That ignorance was our greatest advantage. On the night of July 18th, our coast watchers radioed that a major Japanese reinforcement convoy would be running Blackett Strait, heading for Vella Lavella on Kolombangara, the target we'd been waiting on. Multiple transports, light escort, forced to squeeze through narrow water where their numbers wouldn't do them any good. Mac volunteered PT-164 to lead the attack, with PT-168 under Lieutenant Henry Hank Bramwell and PT-171 skippered by Lieutenant J.G. Joseph Joey Antonelli riding with us. The briefing that evening felt like a funeral and a dare all at once. Intelligence put 3 big transports in the convoy, escorted by 1 or 2 destroyers, and the transports were carrying elements of the Japanese 13th Regiment, battle-hardened troops who'd seen China and the Philippines. These weren't rear-area laborers or supply men. These were frontline soldiers who'd make life miserable for our Marines trying to hold Munda. Commander William Bill Specht, our squadron leader, didn't mince words. "Gentlemen," he said, "that convoy must not reach Vella. I don't care if you have to ram them. They go to the bottom tonight." As the sun slid below the horizon on July 19th and washed the Solomons in a bloody red, we made our final checks. Paddy O'Brien ran his torpedo checklist for the 5th time, setting the Mark 13s to run 10 feet deep at 28 knots, the best bet for hitting a full-load transport. Charlie Mendoza had the engines singing, mufflers fitted to cut noise. Dutch Vanderberg plotted and replotted our approach over and over, factoring currents, wind, and the moon's angle. I walked the deck and checked my guns one last time, making sure the belts fed true. We'd loaded only armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. Ordinary ball ammo was useless against steel hulls, while API and incendiaries could punch bridge windows, start fires, and knock out gun crews. Every 5th round was a tracer, so the lines of fire would show up like deadly fireworks in the night. At 20-30 hours, we slipped our moorings and eased into the growing dark. The 3 boats moved in column, engines down to a low rumble. As we cleared Rendova Harbor, Mac ordered a weapons test. For a few heartbeats, the night lit up with the bark of 12 machine guns and 3 20mm cannons into empty sea. Then silence fell again, broken only by our engines and the whisper of water along the hulls. The sea was rougher than we liked, a 2-foot chop that would make torpedo aiming tricky. But that chop worked for us too. Wakes would be harder to spot, and the waves would help hide engine noise. Every little edge counted when 80 feet of plywood was going after 400 feet of steel. By 2300 hours, we were in position off the north coast of Vella Lavella. Mac shut the engines to idle and we drifted, a ghost in the dark. Only the lap of water against wood and distant artillery from New Georgia broke the quiet. Then, at 2347, Sparks Patterson picked up a Coast Watcher transmission. 3 large ships, 2 escorts bearing 280, speed 18 knots, range 15 miles from your position. The hunt was on. Mac fired up 2 engines at low throttle and we moved into intercept. The math was simple but unforgiving. The convoy was making 18 knots on a steady course. We could push 35 without kicking up too much wake, and if we timed it right, we'd meet them where the channel narrowed and their numbers counted for nothing. Of Blackett Strait, the narrowest stretch of water in the Solomons, where the convoy would have nowhere to run and no room to maneuver. At exactly 00:18 hours, July 20th, Dutch raised his binoculars and spotted them. Dark silhouettes sliding across a field of stars, right where the Coast Watchers said they'd be. The Japanese formation was textbook perfect. 2 destroyers in the lead, 3 big transports in the middle, and another destroyer tailing the column. They were running blacked out. Not a single light showing, but once you knew what to look for, their size and steady spacing gave them away. Mac's plan was daring in its simplicity. PT-168 would swing in from port, PT-171 would come from starboard, and we, PT-164, would charge straight up the middle after the lead transport. It meant sliding right between the escort destroyers, threading the needle with death to either side. But if it worked, the confusion would be total, and all 3 transports would be wide open for the kill. "All ahead slow," Mac whispered. We crept forward at barely 5 knots, letting the convoy close the distance. At 2,000 yards, we could hear them. That deep, steady rumble of diesel engines pushing thousands of tons through black water. At 1,500 yards, the shapes took on detail. The pagoda-style bridge of the lead destroyer, the cargo cranes on the transports, even crewmen moving along the decks. At 1,000 yards, Mac gave the signal. 3 quick clicks on the radio. Instantly, all 3 PT boats jumped to life. Our engines roared from idle to full throttle, the bow lifting clean out of the water as we surged ahead. The quiet night exploded with noise. We tore through the darkness at 40 knots, 3 tiny boats hurtling toward a wall of steel. The Japanese never saw it coming. Their lookouts, trained to spot submarines and distant destroyers, weren't ready for attackers appearing from the shadows at blinding speed. We were inside their formation before they even reacted, racing between the escorts so close I could see faces in the glow of their bridge instruments. I squeezed the triggers on my twin 50s, sweeping fire across the bridge of the nearest destroyer. My tracers smashed through glass and sparked against armor plate. "Fire 1! Fire 2! Paddy O'Brien shouted, loosing our first pair of Mark 13s at a suicidal 600 yards, point blank for a torpedo run. The 2 fish leapt from their tubes with a heavy splash, props biting instantly, carving twin trails of phosphorescent bubbles straight toward the lead transport, a converted passenger liner hauling more than 3,000 Japanese troops. Then the destroyer to starboard spotted us. Its searchlight snapped on, flooding the sea with blinding white light. In the same instant, their 25mm guns opened up, green tracers reaching for us like clawed fingers. Shells hammered the water around us, showering the deck with spray. And then, the torpedoes hit. The first slammed home just after the bridge, detonating with a roar that split the night. The second struck midships, right where it counted. The blast broke the ship's spine. 8,000 tons of steel and humanity lifted, cracked apart, and began sliding under almost at once. Through the chaos, the searchlight glare, the tracer fire, the choking smoke, we saw men spilling into the sea, heard the screams carry across the water even over the engines. A few seconds later, PT-168 made her strike. Both of her Mark 13s found the second transport, a freighter loaded to the brim with ammunition and aviation fuel bound for Kolombangara. The result was apocalyptic. The whole ship went up like a powder keg. The explosion was so violent it threw me flat on the deck. A wave of scalding air and burning fragments slammed into us, rattling the boat like a toy in a storm. Flaming debris rained across the Black Sea, turning the night into a living inferno. Flaming debris rained down around us, setting small fires on our wooden deck. We stomped them out with our boots, smoke stinging our eyes and lungs. The Japanese destroyers were reacting now, but they had a real problem on their hands. We were too close for their main guns, the big 5-inchers, to depress low enough to hit us, and we were mixed right in with their own transports. Firing on us meant risking their own ships. So they did the next best thing. They tried to ram us. One destroyer turned hard to port, its long knife-edged bow aimed straight for our side. At our combined speed, we had maybe 10 seconds before that wall of steel sliced us in half. Mac yanked the wheel to starboard and shoved the throttles past the stops. The Packard screamed like tortured banshees, but our little boat spun on its axis and shot clear, missing the destroyer's bow by less than 10 feet. As we whipped past, I hosed their bridge with a full belt from my twin 50s, sparks flaring as rounds tore through glass and metal. PT-171 wasn't so lucky. Joey Antonelli had lined up a perfect attack run on the third transport when searchlights pinned him dead on. The enemy's 25mm guns opened up, their tracers crawling across the black water until they stitched a neat line of holes across PT-171's bow. One shell struck a torpedo mounted on deck. By some miracle, it didn't explode. The warhead hadn't been armed yet. It had to spin through water first. Still, Joey had no choice but to break off, smoke trailing from his stern as he limped away, taking on water fast. We circled back for another attack, but the element of surprise was gone. Every searchlight in that convoy was blazing, sweeping the water like angry suns. Guns of every size were spitting fire in every direction. The sea boiled with shell splashes. It looked and sounded like a rainstorm made of steel. And now the Japanese had their 5-inch guns in play. One hit from those monsters would have torn us apart like tissue paper. "Launch the remaining fish and get us out of here," Mac bellowed over the roar. Paddy fired our last 2 torpedoes at the third transport. But the Japanese captain spotted the white wakes and reacted fast. He combed the tracks, swinging parallel so both torpedoes slid harmlessly along his sides. That was our cue to run. Mac slammed all 3 throttles to full, and we bolted into the dark, weaving between towering columns of spray as shells fell all around. Behind us, the fight raged on. PT-168, though hit several times, managed to circle back and drive one more torpedo into the second transport, the ammunition ship that had already taken a beating. Her death throes lit up the entire strait. Secondary explosions rolled through her hull like an earthquake before she finally went under. By the time the sea went dark again, 2 of the 3 Japanese transports were gone. Nearly 6,000 soldiers lost to the depths. The last transport and its escorts were still afloat, but shaken to their cores. We regrouped 5 miles south of the battle zone. All 3 boats were battered, but still alive. PT-171 was in rough shape, holes at the waterline, 1 engine dead, and wounded crew aboard. We came alongside to help, hauling their injured over and patching leaks with whatever we had. Mattresses, life jackets, even chunks of decking. PT-168 had lost her radio antenna and taken shrapnel across her superstructure, but she could still fight. Our boat, by some miracle, had escaped with just a few shrapnel punctures, a scorched gun barrel, and some blackened paint. But we were alive, and more importantly, we'd done it. 2 enemy transports sunk, thousands of troops wiped out, and Japan's reinforcement schedule thrown into chaos. The lone surviving transport turned tail and headed back toward Rabaul instead of pressing on to Vella Lavella. The trip home was a slow crawl through fear. At first light, Japanese float planes were out searching for us. We hid in the shadows of tiny islands, draping palm fronds over the deck, cutting the engines and holding our breath as the planes droned overhead. What should have been a 3-hour trip took 14 tense hours, but by nightfall we limped back into Rendova. The debriefing that followed was grueling. Intelligence officers wanted everything: enemy tactics, weapon performance, how quickly they reacted, how they used their lights. Our answers would be copied and sent to every PT squadron across the Pacific. The lessons learned that night would save American lives and send more enemy ships to the bottom before the war was done. But the immediate results were just as powerful. Within days, radio intercepts picked up frantic Japanese messages describing new American secret weapons, high-speed torpedo boats that struck from nowhere and vanished into the dark. For the first time, the Imperial Navy was afraid of the night. They could no longer move without fear once the sun went down. Even their most heavily guarded convoys weren't safe. Every black shadow on the water might hide a PT boat. Every distant rumble might be our engines coming for them. Over the next few weeks, the Japanese completely overhauled the way they ran supplies through the islands. Their convoys got larger but far less frequent. Destroyer escorts doubled, then tripled. They even started sending up float planes fitted with searchlights to scout the seas at night. All those adjustments came with a price: fewer reinforcements and less food or ammo reaching their stranded garrisons. That gave our boys on the ground a fighting edge they'd never had before. But the real victory wasn't just tactical. It was psychological. Japanese troops waiting on those islands for reinforcements that never came began to lose faith. Their commanders, suddenly unable to promise safe delivery of supplies, had to call off attacks altogether. The myth that Japan ruled the night, that their forces were unstoppable after dark, started to crumble, shattered by wooden boats driven by American kids and reservists. Our squadron's success kicked off a full-blown PT boat boom. New bases sprang up all across the Solomons and New Guinea. Improved models rolled out with stronger engines, radar systems, and thin armor shielding. The tactics we'd pieced together through blood and trial became official doctrine, taught at training schools from Rhode Island clear to California. But that kind of progress came with a heavy toll, measured in friends who didn't come home. 2 weeks after that victory in Blackett Strait, PT-166 hit a mine while heading back from patrol. Everyone aboard was lost. A few days later, PT-162 had her engines die in daylight, dead in the water when Japanese destroyers found her. They blasted her to splinters. Only 3 men survived. Then came the worst news of all. Joey Antonelli, skipper of PT-171, was killed by a sniper while his boat refueled at a forward base. By October of 1943, when I finally rotated back to the States for training on new construction, our squadron had lost 7 boats and 73 men. But in that same span, we'd sunk or damaged over 40 Japanese vessels, everything from destroyers to troop barges, and stopped thousands of enemy soldiers from ever reaching the fight. The exchange rate was brutal, but it mattered. Every PT boat could be replaced. The Japanese ships, and the seasoned crews manning them, couldn't. I went back to the Pacific in March of '44 as executive officer aboard PT-321, operating in the Philippines. The boats were better by then: radar, armor, plating around the cockpit, and torpedoes that actually worked when you needed them to. But the spirit of the mission hadn't changed a bit: speed, surprise, and guts. We were still proving that American ingenuity could beat any edge the enemy thought they had. The Japanese never did figure out a way to stop the PTs for good. They tried everything, Hunter-killer destroyer teams, radar pickets, even suicide boats rigged to ram us. But they couldn't be everywhere at once. The night no longer belonged to them, and the sea was never truly safe again. That little secret weapon they dismissed at first had changed the entire balance of power in the Pacific. Mac McPhersonson made it through the war. He earned a Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars, then stayed in the service, eventually commanding a destroyer squadron in Korea. We stayed in touch until his passing in 1987. At his funeral, his son told me Mac always said the PT boats were where he learned what courage really meant. Not the absence of fear, but doing your duty while scared out of your mind. Dutch Vanderberg went back to Yale after the war, but he never stopped thinking about navigation and the sea. He became one of the country's leading oceanographers, using skills he'd honed dodging destroyers to chart ocean currents and map the deep. Once, over coffee, he told me, after threading between Japanese warships at 40 knots in the dark, everything else feels simple. Charlie Mendoza headed back to Los Angeles and returned to his first love, engines. He built a small speed shop, using tricks he'd learned coaxing life out of Packards in the Solomons to make racing cars faster. His garage became legend among hot rodders, with a hand-painted sign that read, "Speed Shop." We made PT boats fly. He'd grin at customers and say, "If I could make 4,500 horses push 50 tons at 45 knots, I can make anything go fast." And Paddy O'Brien. He stayed in the Navy too, becoming one of the service's top torpedo experts. He wrote the manual on Mark 13 torpedo maintenance, the one the Navy used clear into the 1970s. But Paddy never forgot the fish he fired that night off Vella Lavella. He'd grin and say, "Those were my torpedoes that nailed those transports. 2 shots, 2 hits, 6,000 Japs who never got the chance to kill Americans." He was proud of that, and we were proud of him. The story of the PT boats never got the same glory as the big sea battles, Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf. But for those of us who served on those little wooden warriors, we knew we'd been part of something revolutionary. We'd proven that brains and guts could beat size and tradition. We showed that American sailors, a lot of them farm boys, clerks, and mechanics who'd barely seen the ocean before the war, could outfight one of the best navies on Earth and do it on their own terms. The secret to our success wasn't really the boats, though they were damn fine pieces of engineering. It wasn't even the torpedoes, though when they worked beautifully. The real secret was the American spirit of ingenuity, that stubborn willingness to try something new when the old ways stopped working. At first, the admirals wrote us off as joyriders and plywood toys, but it was those toys, crewed by junior officers and volunteer sailors, that proved a handful of fast, angry little boats could change the shape of naval warfare. Whenever I read about today's missile boats, stealth ships, or fast attack tactics, I see the DNA of those PTs in every one of them. We were the start of a whole new way of fighting, one built on speed, surprise, and nerve. We proved that naval combat didn't have to mean massive battleships slugging it out across 20,000 yards. It could be about precision, hitting where the enemy least expected and vanishing before they could hit back. Every modern fast attack craft in today's Navy carries a bit of our bloodline, the spirit of those plywood predators that once haunted the Japanese fleet. The Japanese even came up with a phrase for it in 1943, mosquito boat terror. That fear spread through their ranks like malaria. After the war, captured officers admitted the PT boats caused chaos far beyond their actual numbers. They had to assume we were everywhere. They had to plan for attacks that might never happen. They burned fuel, deployed escorts, and lost sleep chasing shadows that weren't there. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who commanded many of the Tokyo Express runs, later wrote, "The American PT boats were our worst nightmare. Submarines we could hunt with depth charges. Aircraft we could see coming. But these devil boats appeared from nowhere, struck like cobras, and vanished into the night. They made us fear the very darkness we once ruled." That fear, that gnawing uncertainty, was worth more than any single ship we sank. It marked the true turning point, the moment the Imperial Japanese Navy began doubting itself. When sailors trained their whole lives to dominate the night suddenly started fearing it. The psychological battle was already won. The PT boat's evolution through the war was nothing short of incredible. The early models, like ours, were basically peacetime racing hulls pressed into combat. But by 1945, they'd grown teeth. The new boats carried radar, rockets, better torpedoes, even the first crude guided missiles. Yet for all those improvements, the heart of the PT remained unchanged. Small, fast, deadly little craft manned by volunteers crazy enough to gamble their lives against overwhelming odds. One story summed up that spirit perfectly. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a PT squadron went up against the Yamato, the biggest, most heavily armed battleship ever built. Their torpedoes couldn't even punch through her armor belt. They knew it. But they attacked anyway, darting in and firing like hornets around a bear. Their reckless courage forced the Yamato to turn and maneuver, buying precious minutes for our escort carriers to escape. Those little boats didn't sink the giant. But that night, they showed the world what courage on the water really looked like, a mechanic by necessity. Out there, if something broke, you fixed it yourself, because waiting for a repair crew meant waiting to die. The PT bases themselves became the stuff of legend. Names like Rendova, Tulagi, Mios Wendy. They sounded exotic, but to us they meant mosquitoes, malaria, and midnight missions. These weren't places like Pearl Harbor or San Diego with clean bunks and officers' clubs. They were muddy, sweltering outposts where we lived on Spam, cigarettes, and coffee thick enough to chew. Mail took months, and the closest thing to entertainment was poker, tall tales, and rumors about the next big operation. But morale stayed high, because we knew we were making a difference. The natives of the Solomon Islands deserve a special kind of praise. Those people risked everything to help us. They guided our boats through reefs, pulled downed pilots and shipwrecked sailors out of the surf, and brought us word of enemy troop movements. Some were executed when the Japanese caught them helping Americans. Their courage and loyalty were the reason many of us made it home. Without them, we'd have been lost, blind and adrift in that maze of islands. Then there were the coast watchers, those lonely heroes hiding out on Japanese-held islands with nothing but a radio, a pair of binoculars, and their wits. They'd call in warnings like, 40 bombers headed your way, or destroyer squadron moving south at high speed. More than once, those alerts saved our hides, sometimes saving an entire base. We almost never met them face to face, but every man in the PT service knew we owed them our lives. One innovation that changed everything for us was radar. The first sets we got were clunky. Half the time, you couldn't tell if you were looking at an island or a ship. But by late '44, the technology had come a long way. Suddenly we could track targets through pitch darkness and heavy fog. The Japanese, who'd relied for years on sharp eyesight and night training, found themselves on the wrong end of progress. We could see them before they saw us. And that, in a night war, was the ultimate edge. Our tactics evolved right along with the tech. We learned to toss strips of aluminum foil into the air to jam their radar screens. We developed wolf pack tactics. 2, 3, sometimes 4 boats attacking from different angles all at once. We even used shore batteries as decoys, baiting the enemy into firing at false targets so we could slip in for the real strike. But the most dangerous missions were the ones no one ever heard about. No medals, no headlines, just survival. We dropped off coast watchers behind enemy lines. We evacuated pinned-down Marines from beaches under fire. We ferried ammo and supplies to isolated outposts that the big ships couldn't reach. Those runs were brutal, thankless work, but they saved countless lives. We became the Navy's Swiss Army knife, small, fast, and expendable, used for every dirty job too risky for the larger fleet. Life aboard a PT boat was different from any other service. On a destroyer with 300 men, you could go a week without learning a guy's name. On a PT with 12, you knew everything. Who snored, who cursed in his sleep, who froze up under fire, and who you could count on when the world was falling apart. That closeness forged bonds that outlasted the war itself. Even decades later at PT boat reunions, it didn't feel like a gathering of veterans. It felt like family. We'd rib each other about old screw-ups, raise a toast to the ones we'd lost, and slip right back into the same rhythm we had on deck. And the food? Lord, the food deserves its own complaint. We lived off K-rations, Spam, powdered eggs, and whatever we could scrounge or trade from passing ships. Fresh water was precious, saved for drinking, never washing. Baths were in seawater, which left salt crusts that rubbed you raw. Coffee was the real fuel that kept us running. Black, bitter, and strong enough to float a wrench. Some crews got inventive, fishing with hand grenades or trading torpedo alcohol to base personnel for anything that passed as real food. Maintenance was a full-time job. Salt water corroded everything it touched. The tropical sun baked the decks until the wood split. Every patrol meant pounding through waves that shook bolts loose and stressed every pipe and rivet. We spent more hours fixing our boats than fighting from them. Out there, every man, gunner, radio man, even the cook, became a mechanic, because keeping the boat alive was the only way to keep yourself alive. Every man became a mechanic, a carpenter, and an electrician out of sheer necessity. On a PT boat, an engine failure in enemy waters wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. So we treated maintenance like religion. Every nut and bolt got checked, every wire and gasket inspected. The weather in the Solomons was a foe every bit as dangerous as the Japanese. One moment the sea could be glass smooth, the next it was a wall of black water crashing over the bow. Tropical squalls came out of nowhere, turning calm seas into mountains. Lightning could fry your radio, melt your circuits, and make you blind and deaf in the middle of enemy territory. The heat was so brutal, men sometimes fainted at their posts. But that same weather could be our savior, too. Those storms hit us from enemy spotter planes and muffled the roar of our engines. A PT boat could disappear completely in rough seas, just another shadow among the whitecaps. Navigation out there was a lost art, the kind they never taught at Annapolis. Our charts were ancient, half of them drawn back in the 1800s. Reefs shifted after every storm. A passage that was safe one night might be suicide the next. We learned to read the ocean the way hunters read tracks. By the color of the water, the shape of the waves, even the smell of land carried on the wind. When the compass spun wild and the instruments failed, instinct took over. Every patrol added another line to the mental maps we carried in our heads. Maps of danger, survival, and the places we'd left ghosts behind. The Japanese adapted quickly. They built shallow draft destroyers specifically designed to hunt us down. They started coordinating their float planes and destroyers, running complex search patterns to flush us out. They even tried using captured PT boats as decoys to lure us in. But for every trick they came up with, we found a counter trick. It turned into a deadly chess game played at 40 knots, with lives as the stakes. The part nobody really talks about is the psychological toll, living on constant alert, knowing that every time you left base might be the last, watching friends die fast and ugly deaths. It changed you. Some guys cracked under the strain, begged for transfers even if it meant being branded cowards. Others got hooked on the adrenaline, chasing danger like a drug. Most of us just endured. We found ways to make the fear livable. The humor we developed was dark, but it kept us sane. We named our boats things like Sudden Death, Hell's Angels, and Grim Reaper. We painted cartoons on our torpedoes. Donald Duck riding a bomb was a favorite. We sang songs about sinking Japanese ships. The more gruesome the lyrics, the better. It was all armor for the mind, a way to laugh at what would otherwise break you. What started in the Solomons didn't stay there. When the Normandy invasion was planned, PT boats were part of the fleet, guarding against German E-boats. The tactics we'd learned in the Pacific showed up in the Mediterranean, the English Channel, even on European rivers. The things we'd figured out by trial and error in those hot, stinking islands ended up shaping small boat warfare around the world. Looking back now, I'm amazed any of us survived. We were just kids, barely old enough to drink, playing with lethal toys in a war that consumed millions of lives. We made rookie mistakes that should have killed us, took risks that make me shake my head even now. But somehow, through luck, courage, and sheer stubbornness, we turned an unproven idea into one of the deadliest tools in the Navy's arsenal. We proved that American guts and ingenuity could take on any challenge, no matter how impossible it looked, and come out the other side. The PT boat legacy lives on in today's Navy. Every fast attack craft, every special ops boat, every ship built to strike hard and vanish carries a little piece of those mosquito boats in its bones. The sailors who crew them now may never hear about nights off Vella Lavella or the terror we brought to Japanese convoys. But they're the spiritual descendants of that same rule: speed, surprise, and plain audacity. When folks ask if I'm proud of my service, I tell them about July 20th, 1943. 3 little wooden boats took on a major convoy and sent thousands of enemy soldiers to the bottom. We came out of the dark, did what we were sworn to do, and melted away before they could answer. That night we were America's secret weapon, and I honestly believe we helped change the course of the Pacific War. The Japanese weren't just shocked by the boats themselves, they were stunned by what those boats represented. An American willingness to innovate, to take chances, to throw out the old rule book. They'd studied our Navy for years, battleships, carriers, doctrine, and never imagined we'd lob wooden speedboats with torpedoes into their formation. That failure of imagination cost them dearly. The PT boat story is about as American as it gets. We borrowed a British idea, shoved aircraft Packard engines into light hulls, mounted torpedoes meant for destroyers, and filled those boats with civilians who'd barely seen the ocean before Pearl Harbor. By all rights, it shouldn't have worked. But it did, because we made it work with stubbornness, guts, and a whole lot of elbow grease. The last operational PT was retired in 1959, replaced by sleeker, faster craft. Still, for those of us who rode in them during the war, they'll always be the boats that helped win the Pacific. They proved size isn't everything, that courage counts more than armor, and that wooden boats with determined crews could beat anybody, anywhere, anytime. Sitting here in my study with faded photos and yellowed clippings, the sounds and smells come back like a bad dream and a proud memory all at once. I can still hear Packard engines roaring through the night, feel Solomon Sea spray on my face, smell cordite and diesel. Most of all, I feel the pride of being part of something that changed naval warfare forever. We were boys who grew up fast in those plywood hulls, fighting a war we didn't start but were damned sure to finish. We attacked from darkness because that's where we were strongest: our speed, our surprise, and our willingness to do the unexpected. The Japanese learned to fear the night they once owned. They learned that American ingenuity could flip any weakness into an edge. That's the real legacy of the PT boats. Not just the ships we sank or the battles we won, but the proof that free people fighting for their freedom can turn the odds around. We were small, fast, and deadly. Secret weapons that stayed secret long enough to tip the scales. We were the mosquito fleet that helped bring down an empire, one torpedo at a time. By the time the Imperial Navy grasped what we'd become, it was too late. The shadows they'd ruled for years belonged to us, and from those shadows we struck until the rising sun finally set on their Pacific empire.